Gang stalking is, very likely, a disinformation term created by U.S. intelligence agencies. It refers to the intense, long-term, unconstitutional surveillance and harassment of a person who has been designated as a target by someone associated with America's security industry. Such operations have nothing to do with criminal gangs. Official domestic counterintelligence operations of this type are, apparently, perpetrated by federal agents and intelligence/security contractors, sometimes with the support of state and local law enforcement personnel. Unofficial operations of this type are, apparently, perpetrated by private investigators and vigilantes, including many former agents and cops, some of whom are members of the Quasi-Governmental Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Units, LEIU, sometimes on behalf of corporate clients and others with connections to the public and private elements of America's security industry. The goal of such operations, in the parlance of counterintelligence agents, is disruption of the life of an individual deemed to be an enemy, or potential enemy, of clients or members of the security state. Arguably, the most accurate term for this form of harassment would be counterintelligence stalking. Agents of Communist East Germany's Stasi, state police, referred to the process as Zersetzung, German for decomposition or corrosion, a reference to the severe psychological, social, and financial effects upon the victim. American and British victims have described the process as no-touch torture, a phrase which also captures the nature of the crime: cowardly, unethical, and often illegal, but difficult to prove legally, because it generates minimal forensic evidence. Tactics include, but are not limited to, slander, blacklisting, mobbing, intense, organized harassment in the workplace, black bag jobs, residential break-ins, abusive phone calls, computer hacking, framing, threats, blackmail, vandalism, street theater, staged physical and verbal interactions with minions of the people who orchestrate the stalking, harassment by noises, and other forms of bullying. Both the facts and the geographical distribution of relevant published news reports, as well as other evidence cited on this website, suggest that such stalking is sanctioned, and in some cases, orchestrated, by federal agencies. However, news reports, credible anecdotal information, and my own experiences, indicate that such stalking is also sometimes used unofficially for personal and corporate vendettas by current and former corrupt employees of law enforcement and intelligence agencies, private investigators, and their clients. Since counterintelligence stalking goes far beyond surveillance, into the realm of psychological terrorism, it is essentially a form of extrajudicial punishment. As such, the harassment is illegal, even when done by the government. It clearly violates, for example, the U.S. Constitution's Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unwarranted searches, and the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees the right to a trial. Such operations also violate similar fundamental rights defined by state constitutions. Stalking is also specifically prohibited by the criminal codes of every state in America. Although the term gang stalking is intentionally misleading, it does have one merit: it is accurate in the sense that the perpetrators, law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and private security thugs, do often function in the manner of criminal gangs. Although they sometimes conduct their operations under the color of law, many of their activities have neither constitutional nor moral legitimacy. That is true of all of the likely major perpetrators of organized stalking in the U.S., the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. military counterintelligence agencies, state and local law enforcement intelligence units, LEIUs, and security contractors. All of those groups, and other federal intelligence agencies, such as the CIA and NSA, have well-documented histories of abusing their powers. Organized stalking methods were used extensively by Communist East Germany's Stasi, state police, as a means of maintaining political control over its citizens. Although they are illegal in the U.S., the same covert tactics are quietly used by America's local and federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies to suppress dissent, silence whistleblowers, and get revenge against persons who have angered someone with connections to the public and private agencies involved. Illegal counterintelligence operations have been perpetrated against Americans by urban police departments in the U.S. since the late 1800s. Traditionally, the groups of mostly undercover police officers involved are called Red Squads, although the modern official term is Law Enforcement Intelligence Units, LEIUs. The most well-documented example of such operations was the FBI's infamous COINTELPRO, counterintelligence programs, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. Those operations ran from 1956 until 1971, when they were exposed by political activists who broke into an FBI office and obtained secret documents which they handed over to the press. COINTELPRO's official goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize individuals and groups deemed to be subversive. Tactics. As the U.S. Senate's investigation of COINTELPRO found, tactics used by the FBI included many of the methods associated with gang stalking, such as overt surveillance, stalking for psychological operations purposes. The agency even perpetrated crimes such as blackmail and assassinations. Organized stalking methods include warrantless electronic surveillance, slander, blacklisting, and a variety of psychological operations. The latter presumably exploit findings from studies such as the notorious MKUltra experiments conducted on American and Canadian citizens by the CIA, as well as the aforementioned psychological torture tactics refined by the Stasi. In fact, as explained in the overview below, former CIA analyst and expert on the history of U.S. spying, George O'Toole, wrote about a connection between the CIA and the aforementioned LEIUs. An organized stalking victim is systematically isolated and harassed in a manner intended to cause sustained emotional torment while creating the least possible amount of evidence of stalking that would be visible to others. The process is sometimes referred to as no-touch torture. Methods are specifically chosen for their lack of easily captured objective evidence. Perpetrators use common annoyances such as constant noise by neighbors or rude comments and abusive behavior by strangers, but on a frequent, ongoing, long-term basis. The cumulative effects of relentless exposure to such tactics can amount to psychological torture for the victim. Accomplices, such as neighbors, co-workers, and even friends or relatives of the victim in some cases, are recruited to participate, often unwittingly, by counterintelligence personnel using various means, such as by telling them that the target is a potential threat or that the target is the subject of an investigation. A whole set of psychological operations are perpetrated against targeted individuals. These methods, described in detail in the overview below, include such things as threats, slander, vandalism, abusive phone calls, computer hacking, tormenting the victim with noise, and mobbing, orchestrated verbal harassment by strangers, neighbors, or co-workers. Accounts by numerous victims of organized stalking share common specific details, suggesting that the perpetrators are following a well-tested and standardized playbook of methods that have proven to be easily kept off of the radar of potential witnesses and the mainstream news media. Disinformation. In addition to the use of covert methods, another factor contributing to the low profile of organized stalking in the media is a disinformation campaign, a common tactic in counterintelligence operations. In the case of organized stalking, the disinformation is mainly intended to mitigate exposure of the program. Toward that end, the internet has been flooded with websites and forum comments about gang stalking that falsely purport to be from self-proclaimed victims of organized stalking, making irrational claims, references to demons and such. The intended effect is to convey the impression that everyone who claims to be targeted by gang stalking is simply delusional. An additional disinformation strategy has been the establishment of front groups, most notably, FFCHS, Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance, ostensibly a gang stalking victim support group, but actually an organization run by counterintelligence operatives. Scope of operations. U.S. Department of Justice crime statistics from a 2006 survey indicated that an estimated 445,220 stalking victims reported being stalked by 3 or more perpetrators. Such statistics suggest the existence of activities whose scope cannot be explained simply as stalking by criminals, especially given that the otherwise comprehensive index of crime categories in the DOJ's website conspicuously makes no mention of this type of stalking. Another indication of how common organized stalking in the U.S. has become can be seen if you perform a search engine query of the term gang stalking. You will get millions of results. The total silence of the DOJ and FBI on this crime is an obvious clue that it is sanctioned by those agencies. Organizational structure. Ted L. Gunderson was a high-level FBI official during the COINTELPRO era. After he retired from the agency, he asserted that a much more sophisticated version of COINTELPRO began to re-emerge in the 1980s. A link to Gunderson's affidavit on the subject is included in the overview below. Based on news reports, accounts of self-proclaimed victims, and the DOJ statistics cited above, the apparent scope of current organized stalking operations would require the acquiescence of multiple federal and local government agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Justice, among others. Local and federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies now share crime and national security information via a nationwide network of data fusion centers, an element of the extensive post-9/11 Homeland Security infrastructure. America's now vast industry of intelligence security contractors, federal intelligence agencies, there are 16 not including the Director of National Intelligence Office, and the hundreds of local police department law enforcement intelligence units, LEIUs, make it difficult to speculate about exactly how domestic counterintelligence operations are currently being administered. Increasingly common reports of illegal spying by corporations as well as reports of police officers and federal agents sometimes initiating gang-stalking operations for personal vendettas further complicate the analysis. Numerous job listings by intelligence/security contractor corporations for surveillance role players with active security clearances and training in counterintelligence, links and details in the overview below, strongly suggest that federal law enforcement agencies have largely outsourced these operations, which would be consistent with other security programs. A June 10, 2013 article in USA Today noted that about 1.4 million Americans had top-secret security clearances. Federal and local law enforcement agencies also make extensive use of criminal informants, who are in large supply in America, with its extraordinary per capita incarceration rate. It would be natural for such informants to be used in a counterintelligence program. Indeed, the original COINTELPRO was found by the U.S. Senate's Church Committee investigations to have delegated some activities to organized crime groups. First-hand accounts of self-proclaimed victims of gang stalking support this assumption. By their appearance and behavior, many street-level perpetrators appear to possibly be ex-convicts. Regardless of the exact nature of organized stalking in the U.S., any national counterintelligence program would require at least passive acquiescence by the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, just like the first version of COINTELPRO did. U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy approved some of the original COINTELPRO operations. Because of the critical role of the DOJ in allowing organized stalking to occur, I devote an entire section of this overview to that agency. Target selection. Gang stalking apparently targets American citizens deemed to be dissidents or whistleblowers, and perhaps potential dissidents and whistleblowers, although others might be targeted for other reasons, such as for experimental or training purposes. For perspective, it should be remembered that for 2 decades the CIA performed secret illegal experiments on U.S. and Canadian citizens, the infamous MKUltra program. Those experiments included physical and psychological torture. A lot of accounts by self-proclaimed targets of gang stalking suggest that people are often subjected to severe long-term harassment simply because they crossed someone connected with the agencies and security firms which perpetrate such operations. An example of that type of abuse occurred in April 2012, when USA Today reported that one of its reporters and an editor were slandered by a secret disinformation campaign waged by an intelligence contractor firm to discredit them because the newspaper had investigated and reported on that contractor. The company involved conducted propaganda campaigns for the U.S. military. Similarly, in August 2013 it was reported that at least a dozen National Security Agency, NSA, employees had used their surveillance system access to spy on their current and former spouses and partners. Implications. In addition to being morally reprehensible, gang stalking, just like the original version of the FBI's COINTELPRO operations, is illegal. It violates criminal laws in all 50 states against stalking, as well as grossly violating the U.S. Constitution's prohibitions against warrantless searches and extrajudicial punishment. While the vast majority of Americans are never personally targeted by gang stalking, they should still be concerned about the existence of such operations. Even if such activities were constitutionally legitimate, clearly they are not, they would still have an enormous potential for abuse as a personal or political weapon by the practitioners. Ending this cowardly and illegal practice by law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and their parasitic corporate contractors will require exposing what is happening to the public. Anyone reading this can assist with that exposure by simply sharing this information with others. 2. Introduction to the full explanation of gang stalking. I urge readers to consider the evidence presented here in its totality. The nature of organized stalking, by design, is such that it is difficult to comprehend and evaluate without considering it in its full context. With the goal of providing some of that context, the first page of this website, COINTELPRO News, includes not only the relatively infrequent mainstream press articles specifically about gang stalking, but also news which is only indirectly related. Published news and analysis of subjects such as government secrecy, police corruption, privacy, surveillance, private investigators, and various government scandals are relevant to organized stalking in ways which I try to make clear. I hope readers are not put off by my sometimes harsh views on related political topics. I express my opinions here candidly, and the intensity of my rhetoric is partly a function of having been on the sharp end of gang stalking for years. As for my analysis of organized stalking, I try to be as measured and cautious as possible while still confronting the reality that the subject requires a certain amount of speculation because of the secrecy and deception which surrounds it. Given the current state of technologies and government policies concerning surveillance, the average American faces many potential and actual invasions of privacy. For individuals targeted for gang stalking, the situation is infinitely worse. Given all of that, this website is only nominally anonymous. Anyone associated with the professional news media who is interested in additional information about my personal experiences with gang stalking can reach me at the email address I have provided. Thank you for taking an interest in this material. For victims of gang stalking, I hope that the information I post here will be helpful. Counterintelligence is the detection and countering of threats posed by enemy subversion, espionage, and sabotage. Counterintelligence operations include surveillance, spying on enemies, sabotage, disruption of enemies' activities, and disinformation, efforts to deceive enemies and, when it serves the objectives of the counterintelligence program, the public. A wide range of activities can qualify as counterintelligence operations, depending upon how a targeted person or group is deemed to be an enemy, and what activities and thoughts are deemed to be subversive. The FBI famously spied on Martin Luther King, Jr., for example, and even tried to blackmail him, on the grounds that his views were subversive. Although some of the strategies and tactics associated with counterintelligence operations are used by private security personnel, for example, on behalf of corporate clients, they are most frequently used by government intelligence agencies. Here, for example, is a description of the organizational nature of counterintelligence, in a Wikipedia entry. In most countries the counterintelligence mission is spread over multiple organizations, though one usually predominates. There is usually a domestic counterintelligence service, usually part of a larger organization such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States. Uses of counterintelligence tactics by security personnel can be completely legal, for example, a government wiretap authorized by a legitimate search warrant. In other cases, the tactics are purely illegal, for example, black bag jobs, break-ins, and computer hacking by private investigators. Often though, the tactics are in a gray area of dubious legality. For example, depending upon the context, a warning can actually be a veiled threat. Similarly, if an agent or private investigator contacts a friend, relative, or associate of a targeted person, under the pretense of conducting an investigation, such contact can actually be an act of slander, the intentional destruction of the reputation and relationships of the target, even if it is difficult to legally prove.
I want to say thank you to the creator of the website. Thank you for the research you took the time and effort to do, and thank you for the information you put forth. This is one of the 2 websites that helped me somewhat understand this assault of my life when it first started. God bless you.